This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Returning to the show today is Laurie Calhoun. Laurie is a senior fellow at the Libertarian Institute and the author of multiple books and articles, including last year's Questioning the COVID Company Line and We Kill Because We Can. She published a recent article at the Libertarian Institute entitled Sham-ocracy, Scam-ocracy, in which she explores how the rhetoric of democracy has been used in pursuit of very anti-democratic ends. We will be discussing this article on the show today. Laurie, welcome back to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you.
I think that you and my friend Cody Cook have both had the privilege of being on my show 4 times. Between the two of you, you guys have been like my most frequent guests, and I've always gotten a great reception from your other shows. But since I had you on about a year ago to talk about your book, Questioning the COVID Company Line, I've gotten some new listeners. So just introduce yourself to anyone in my audience that might not be familiar with your work.
Okay, so as you mentioned, I'm a senior fellow at the Libertarian Institute. I'm also a research fellow at the Independent Institute. So I'm an independent kind of gal, and I have been writing on primarily war for the duration of the 21st century. I think I started writing my first essays on war in 1999, as a matter of fact, with the bombing of Kosovo. But I also was very critical of the first Gulf War in 1991. I was a grad student at Princeton at the time in philosophy, and I was really appalled because Princeton gave George H.W. Bush an honorary doctorate after that war, which I felt was completely uncalled for. I was, granted in the minority at that point. Most of the country was behind the war effort because the propaganda was so slick. And nearly everyone supported what he was doing. But I was opposed to that initial Iraq war. And then again in 2003, of course, the second Iraq war. Basically, I guess you could say I've been against every war during my lifetime. So I've been writing about it because I feel like someone has to push back, because we've had less and less criticism from the mainstream press. And I feel like someone has to take these people to task as they kill millions of people around the world. So just writing a lot of essays. I've published, as you mentioned, several books, 2 on war specifically. One is called War and Delusion, a critical examination in which I look very carefully at the just war paradigm, which has guided the rhetoric more than the thought of leaders since the Middle Ages regarding war. And so I'm very critical of that paradigm in that book. And in We Kill Because We Can, From Soldiering to Assassination in the Drone Age, I criticize specifically the use of remote control technology to execute suspects from a distance without indictment or trial.
Yeah, those are both fantastic books, by the way. And a lot of what you write about in War and Delusion, we're going to cover on the show today. So your article, as I said in the introduction, is called Sham-ocracy, Scam-ocracy. And it does a great job of highlighting how the rhetoric of democracy is often used in very anti-democratic ways. And obviously, we're coming up on a major election. It's 2024. But what was the motivation behind writing the article when you did?
I think I was just struck by the fact that both sides of the war party duopoly, now led by Biden on the Democrat side and Trump on the Republican side, keeps telling their followers that if his adversary is elected, that will be the end of democracy. And so it's like, what is going on here? I mean, it's just being used at this point as a political slogan. And so I started thinking about the sense in which either one of these people has defended democracy or not, or poses a true threat to democracy. And this is what came out of it, this essay.
Yeah, and this is one of these interesting things that it's kind of like what you wrote about in your book, Questioning the COVID Company Line, where you talked about how the rhetoric of science was used in a way that was like just intrinsically unscientific. So the word science during the pandemic came to mean what the people that were in power said that we all had to comply with. I mean, that was literally what the word means, which was completely divorced from its actual definition. Democracy is kind of the same way, as you're going to argue in this piece. So I think at the outset of this conversation, maybe you should define for us what democracy is actually supposed to mean, and then how that word is used in the contemporary Western world.
Okay, sure. Well, obviously, just from the etymology, demo and cracy, so rule by the people. It's like a form of government where the people themselves decide how they should be governed, in effect, by either directly making decisions together on every single issue or through electing representatives who, on their behalf, will make decisions for them. So we live in ostensibly a representative democracy where we elect people and then they implement laws supposedly on our behalf and we comply with those laws or we decide to leave the country. So those are our choices.
Yeah.
And we don't have a pure democracy because we have a constitution. So in the United States, we have a democratic republic. The constitution is basically a constraint. It involves a list of rules that you can't violate, even if the majority decided that they wanted to violate them. So it's a document that was drawn up by the first leaders of this nation, and it lays out basically the broad framework of our society, and then the details are decided every time the new group of politicians comes in and debates how things should be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And how have these political leaders appropriated the term democracy? Because you see people on both the left and the right using this term, but it's very obvious that they mean different things when they say it. So talk to us about the political application of this term democracy and the way our leaders often use this rhetorically.
Okay, well, as you can see in populist rhetoric with someone like Donald Trump, he is appealing directly to the people and saying, I represent you. And the establishment is this antithetical group of elites who are against you. And so I think that I am going to save democracy by not allowing these oligarchs basically to take over your country and tell you how you should live your lives. Okay. On the other hand, we have Biden and Harris, and they claim to be the big champions of democracy because they say that Donald Trump is an authoritarian and he will be, quote unquote, literally Hitler when he comes to power. Yeah, we can talk about the assassination attempt yesterday if you like.
Yeah.
Very timely, actually. So they are constantly hammering this idea that this person, this populist leader, Donald Trump, in fact, is a dictator in waiting, and he's going to implement all these authoritarian, anti-democratic policies. I think it's really used as a political slogan right now and more a source of a means of fear-mongering. So both of them are trying to scare people into voting for them and against their adversary on the grounds that the world will, never return to democracy if they themselves are not elected. So it's interesting how this has played out and how both figures have displayed really anti-democratic tendencies in terms of their foreign policy and also in terms of their censorship. For example, their treatment of Julian Assange. They both were complicit in the persecution of Julian Assange. And so you can't say that you're a defender of democracy if you don't support freedom of speech. And so that case was a test case, in my view, for who really is a champion of democracy. And neither Trump nor Biden has been in that sense.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point with Julian Assange because he is universally hated by both the Democratic and the Republican establishment, even though all that he was doing was exposing the war crimes and the lies of the United States government. And one of the centerpieces of your article, and you've already kind of alluded to this before, is that both frontrunners for the political parties, both Joe Biden and Donald Trump, now regardless of either of them actually make it to the election day in November, that's something that remains to be seen, but they're both part of, in your own words, the war party duopoly. So talk to us about the war party duopoly and how that's intrinsically or inherently a disconnect from democracy.
Okay, sure. A really good example of this is the ongoing war in Ukraine, which has received massive funding by political representatives of the United States government in the House and the Senate. even though the people themselves don't seem to really be that keen on sending, I think it's $200 billion by now to Ukraine to maintain what has turned into a meat grinder war and which has essentially no end in sight. But it reaps enormous military profits for military industry. And a lot of the politicians are supported by lobbyists in the military industrial complex. And so as a result, there's a presumption in favor of whatever war there is around the world that we can get involved in. And both Trump and Biden have continued these wars that began after 9/11, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. They have continued them in their own ways, and they have bombed several different countries. Both of them have stood up for Israel's supposed right to self-defense as they destroy Gaza Strip and the people living there on the pretext that they are conducting national self-defense against the Hamas members who killed about 1,000 Israeli citizens on October 7th, 2023. So they've now slaughtered more than 40,000 civilians inhabiting Gaza in what really is an act of collective punishment. And all of our wars this century have been acts of collective punishment. And both Trump and Biden have supported those, as did Barack Obama and certainly George W. Bush. So this is intrinsically anti-democratic. When you punish innocent people for the crimes of other people, that is the opposite of democracy. Democracy is supposed to be, you have processes by which you can hold people to account for their crimes and, punish them if that's what your law proscribes. But what's happening in these cases is leaders of certain groups or countries commit crimes, and then the people living under those leaders are punished and often killed in their stead. So this has nothing to do with democracy, and yet constantly we're told that democracy is at stake. So, for example, in Ukraine, democracy is at stake despite the fact that Vladimir Zelensky recently canceled the presidential elections for 2024, remaining in power on the grounds that, quote unquote, we are at war. He has imposed martial law, and he is sending out the conscription police to round up all the men between the ages of 16 and 60 who have not volunteered to serve in this war. So these people don't want to fight in the war. They don't believe that it's worth sacrificing their life over this border dispute. And yet the war is propelled forward by the constant infusion of new implements of homicide by the United States, NATO, and other European countries. So these are examples where, particularly Israel, I suppose I could say, if we're going to talk about Biden and Trump, illustrate that both of these presidential candidates are members of the war party duopoly, whatever democratic rhetoric they may issue to the contrary, because they both support these initiatives which are intrinsically anti-democratic.
That is the perfect setup for the rest of the questions that I'm going to ask you today. The first one that I want to ask you is regarding the Biden administration's claims that democracy is on the line in the 2024 election. And, I've been alive for 35 years at this point. Every single election is the most important election of our lifetime. It's kind of always framed in this way. But the Democrats over the last, really since 2016, have seemed to be even more hysterical about this threat to democracy than ever before. But you point out in your article that, and you're not a partisan here, you're just pointing this out in terms of pure fact, that the way that Donald Trump has been treated by the establishment, both in the mainstream media and in the political class, has been pretty undemocratic over the last couple of years. And you reference in particular the Russiagate conspiracy theory, and then you also talk about the Trump trials, where he was charged with 34 felony counts of essentially campaign finance violation laws, which I'm pretty sure every politician, if pushed, could be convicted of. So I want you to talk about those two, and then obviously in between us, me sending you these questions and then the recording. We're recording on Monday, July 15th. 2 days ago, there was an assassination attempt against Donald Trump. I don't know if you want to talk about that in regards to this as well, but just talk to us about the way that Trump has been treated by the quote unquote democratic establishment.
Okay, sure. From the beginning of his presidency, the legitimacy of his presidency was called into question by Hillary Clinton and all of her cronies, which is ironic because then when it came to be that people were disputing the 2020 election results, suddenly it was supposed to be unacceptable to ask questions about what happened during the election. Okay, was there stuffing of ballot boxes? Were there thousands of votes from single addresses? Were lots of dead people voting? You were not allowed to ask those questions in 2020, when in fact Hillary Clinton was asking those questions in 2016 when she lost to Donald Trump. So it started way back in 2016. Actually, I think even before 2016, the Clinton campaign itself initiated the composition of what came to be known as the Steele dossier, which was used as the primary document to demonstrate the alleged collusion between the Russian government and Donald Trump. So for 4 entire years, for the duration of his presidency, the claim was made across all mainstream media platforms that Donald Trump was in cahoots with Vladimir Putin. And the only reason why Donald Trump was elected was because the Russians had interfered in the election. Okay, so all sorts of investigations were undertaken and looked into. Turned out that the Russian government had bought some ads, I think on Facebook, maybe like $100,000 of ads or something. But in fact, none of the substance of the claims that Trump was in collusion with Vladimir Putin was ever demonstrated. And so it's largely been discarded by most rational people. Unfortunately, not everyone is rational still. We have a hardcore group of people suffering from what has come to be known as Trump derangement syndrome, who they can't get out of their mind that somehow Trump is a Russian agent. I think they've been propagandized so effectively over the years of the Trump presidency that they'll never let go of that idea. They keep waiting for that final conviction. And so they've been waiting this year as Trump has faced a variety of bizarre legal challenges, including the one in which he was convicted of 34 felonies for essentially misclassifying a hush money payment to a porn star as a legal fee. Well, it turns out that Hillary Clinton herself did the same thing. They misclassified the money used to fund the composition of the Steele dossier as a legal fee. So they did the very same thing. And not only that, but quite a number of congresspersons have had sexual harassment and other charges of malfeasance hushed up through payments from taxpayer money that has not been disclosed. So basically, lots of people have violated this supposed law that Trump himself violated, but he's the only one that anyone has ever gone after about it. So it really looks like a politically motivated form of lawfare where you try to go after your adversary. And it looks very suspicious because it's under the Biden administration, and Biden is, in fact, his political adversary in the presidential campaign. So this has been going on for years. And I think it was Tucker Carlson who predicted that, first you try to discredit people, and then you try to throw them in jail, throw them in prison. And then the next logical step, if you live in a sort of banana republic, is you try to have your political adversary killed. So what happened the day before yesterday was that someone actually tried to kill Donald Trump. And so there's some reason for believing that this happened in part because of the incredibly inflammatory rhetoric against this man over the past, now it's been, how many years has it been? Almost 8 years. So
yeah.
It's just gone on and on and on. I mean, you turn on the television and you hear about convict Donald Trump. Even the way the news is couched now, it always involves denouncing him in some way. And so you see covers of magazines, I think it was the New Republic, they show Trump looking like Hitler. And you see all of these newscasters saying, oh, Trump is literally Hitler, and we're going to have dictatorship, it's the end of democracy. This has been going on and on. Joe Biden himself, not too long ago, I think it may have been only last week, said that it's time to put Trump in the bullseye. So, of course, he was speaking figuratively. He wasn't telling anyone to go assassinate Trump. But when this young shooter has been indoctrinated to the point where he actually believes that Trump is literally Hitler, then it probably, to his mind, seemed the right thing to do. And so he went out and tried to kill literally Hitler. So this is where we are right now. Now, Biden is trying to calm things down, and everyone's trying to call for unity, but it's hard to see how this can work given the years of what I would call slander of Trump. And I'm no fan of Trump. I mean, as you know from the essay, right, I am very critical of him as well. But, there's a point at which what has become pure political persecution cannot be denied. And we have reached that point.
Yeah, I completely agree with that characterization of it, too. The other factor that we have to consider, at least as far as leftist critiques of political figures and parties on the right go, is that in the last month, there was a very important election in England and a very important election in France. And both of those kind of shifted the political gravity in those countries to the left. A lot of the reason for that was the rhetoric that these far-right parties were anti-democratic in some way. I want to get your comment on that, but it is interesting that just this morning I was actually reading an article over at the Mises Institute, and I can't remember what the title of it is. I'll try to put a link in the show notes for anyone that wants to read it. And in this article, the author was arguing that the far right party, the supposedly far right party in France, was smeared as such because they were actually against more French intervention in the Ukrainian war. So there was kind of this strain of anti-war populism in this far right party, and he was suggesting that might be the reason why they were, one, characterized as far right, and two, smeared so much in the media. So I'd love to get your thought on that as well. How is that whole the whole process of characterizing anyone that's on the right as undemocratic? How does that fit into this? And then also the idea that there are some center right parties and politicians that are, like, to their core, at least, war skeptical.
Yes, that's a good division to draw right there, because it looks like the cleavage in all of these societies is between the people who really have a if you like, America first or a France first or a Britain first approach, more of a populist, like, what do the people want us to do? And then the oligarchic elite WEF, EU, NATO group who want you to do what the elites tell you to do and want to use your money for their projects. So the governments who have come out against the prolongation and the support of the Ukraine conflict, which really can't be resolved except by negotiation or in a nuclear confrontation. The countries which have said, enough, we've poured enough money into this, it's time for Putin and Zelensky to get to the negotiation table. And there are a number of countries who have said this. Hungary is one of them. Trump is one of them. Trump has claimed that if he's reelected, he will resolve the Ukrainian conflict in 24 hours. So right away, he is a target for all the NATO people, all of the European Union people, such as Ursula von der Leyen, who's been pushing for the Ukrainian war forever. And some of the European parliamentary members, the few who were against the intervention in Ukraine and the constant infusion of arms and money to Ukraine, lost their seats recently. So one was Claire Daly, one was Mike Wallace from Ireland. So they were the most outspoken. They're also constantly criticizing what's going on in Israel in terms of the treatment of the Palestinian people. They lost their seats. So what has happened in all these cases is a lot of money flows to the people who are willing to hold the company line, and they get reelected by hook or by crook, and then they continue to push forward the same rhetoric according to which, Putin is evil, Trump is evil. Anyone who agrees that we should not be in Ukraine is also evil. So it's a real Manichaean dichotomy where we are good and you are evil, and the far right has been cast as the evil character here because they are quote unquote Putin sympathizers is the line. And the same line is being used in all these countries. And you can see that the propaganda comes straight from the people who want to promote the ongoing intervention.
And you talk about Emmanuel Macron, the current president of France, who has been very critical, or not critical of, he's been very extremely supportive of the war in Ukraine, and has gotten France into a position where it's been intervening in some much more significant ways, maybe even in the United States. They're sending trainers and things like that into Ukraine. But the problem with that is that Macron himself has kind of a rough track record when it comes to upholding policies that the average person might think to be democratic. So talk to us about Macron's track record. Why is he not necessarily the best representative of democracy?
Yeah, Macron is a bit of a slippery figure, to be honest. Okay, so he, as you know, he had a bad result in the recent elections, and so rather the recent parliamentary elections, and so rather than waiting for the official election, he called a snap election. His reason for calling a snap election was that he wanted to scare people into voting against the possibility of Marine Le Pen coming to power, the far right. Okay, so she also is a populist leader, and she is plagued by the history of her father, who was a known racist. And so basically, he wants to paint the whole far right as, race is completely unacceptable. Again, you're going to have like a dictator in power. The very same rhetoric that you see from the Biden camp against Trump. Okay, so all these populist leaders are supposedly intrinsically evil, and they're dangerous. They're dangerous to democracy. Okay, so Macron called this snap election, and he made a deal with what he would consider to be the devil, because he's a centrist. He made a deal with the far left and basically said, we got to stop the far right. And so his gamble paid off, and more parliamentary seats were won by the far left than by any other group. And so instead of normally what the leader would do is appoint far right people to his cabinet, but he's sort of shafting them, and he wants to appoint his own centrist people anyway, which is of course incensing the far left, who decided to collaborate with him because he's betrayed them. He said, come with me and we will stop the far right. And then basically he used this as a way to just hold on to his own centrist sort of WEF, New World Order power. And you're right, he has been very outspoken in terms of denouncing Putin and infusing more and more arms into the conflict, and in fact suggesting even that there may need to be soldiers sent, into the European soldiers sent to fight in the Ukrainian war. So that was a big turnoff to the people. They're like, no, thank you. We don't want World War III. So another example, just not directly related to war, but during the COVID crisis, he really criminalized large portions of his society by making it illegal for anyone who didn't get the shot, the experimental mRNA, quote unquote, vaccine. He made it illegal for them to socialize. They couldn't go to stores and cafes and restaurants. They couldn't use public transportation. That was an assault on the working class right there. So, because who uses public transportation but the working class? Rich people have their own cars, their chauffeurs. So the only people who need to use public transportation are working people. And so that was a huge assault on them. And so needless to say, he's not popular among populist types. But he's managed to hold on to power, and he's still there. And he's still pushing these very dangerous ideas, such as, the old vaccine passport. He was a big guy on that. And of course, he wants central bank digital currency. He wants that whole he's a techno leader. I'm not going to say he's a techno fascist. That's what, some people would call these people, but he definitely is all in on this new normal and this quote unquote great reset. Okay, so this phrase "great reset" was used by all sorts of figures who got behind the COVID regime, and it's resurfacing again. So the new prime minister in Britain is talking about we need a new great reset. So it's a little bit scary because these people are all on the same page. They all read from the same playbook, and they appear to be intent on establishing a global order to which we will all be somehow required to conform. And that includes things such as the possible pandemic treaty, which they've been working on in the background, ever since the pandemic. even though the vaccines didn't actually work, the WHO wants to have the power to basically tell citizens what they can and cannot do should another pandemic ever arrive on the scene. And that's a very dangerous situation, which populist people oppose. And this group of WEF, New World Order people actually embrace because it gives them more and more power.
Well, it is definitely a terrifying prospect, and it is an obvious threat to like actual rule by the people. And for many Americans, the alternative to that way of doing politics has been Donald Trump, and Donald Trump has been proclaimed as a populist, kind of hailed as the hero to the average people. And I live in Trump country. I walk down the streets, and there's actually a guy like right now. I'm looking at his house right now, right down the road from my house, who has a flag that says Trump 2024, Save America Again, which I guess implies that Trump saved America the first time around, which I don't see how anyone can sustain that argument. And that's exactly the point that I want to ask you about right now, because we have spent a lot of time kind of trashing the left in the way that they understand democracy. And there are a lot of people on the right that think that Trump is the only antidote to that. But Trump himself is not, he talks a good game. And I understand why so many people on the right think that he's a populist hero, because and I think this is his one redeeming value, is that he pisses off all the right people. And I know a lot of people that, I have like a lot of my friends and family members, they vote for Donald Trump because they look at him as a middle finger towards the establishment. That's exactly the reason why they do it. But he didn't actually lead that way. And you make that point in your work. So I want you to talk about Donald Trump's legacy and how Donald Trump might not necessarily be the populist, democratic, freedom-loving hero that he's portrayed to be by the right.
Well, first of all, as you know, he famously claimed in his first presidential election campaign that he would drain the swamp. Okay, draining the swamp, that suggests getting rid of all these, this bureaucracy. So these institutions which basically run our lives, even though they're run by unelected bureaucrats. Okay, so the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, go down the list of the alphabet soup agencies. These people are actually running the government, is the idea. And he claimed that he's going to drain the swamp. Okay, well, far from draining the swamp, he took on people like John Bolton as advisors, Mike Pompeo, some of the worst neocons. I mean, from the perspective of anti-war folk, some of the worst neocons he invited into his administration. Nikki Haley's another one. Okay, so he really didn't drain the swamp. And not only that, but the swamp, nearly drowned him. They really made his life miserable for like the duration of his presidency. And yet he was uniquely ineffective at doing what he had said that he would do. Not only that, but he just prolonged many of the same foreign policies that Obama had prolonged and expanded after George W. Bush. So he really he did not deliver on his campaign promises. He said, enough of the foreign interventions. We're not going to be like having these endless wars. We're going to bring all the soldiers home. He really didn't do this. He instead did things like assassinated an Iranian general in Baghdad, causing a big, uproar around the world, but vaunting it as some sort of act of heroism or courage. And, that was a policy that he was able to implement only because Obama had already been doing it. Obama had been assassinating people. Obama even assassinated U.S. citizens without indictment or trial. So basically, Trump inherited the capacity to do that from Obama. Since no one stopped Obama, then Trump, of course, always had to do things bigger and better than Obama. So he went out and directly assassinated a general and bragged about it. Okay, so this has just gotten worse and worse. And so now he's sort of talking out of both sides of his mouth, because he claims that he wants to, for example, end the Ukrainian conflict, which is a good thing. But then he's also talking about making our military even bigger and even stronger. I think he said he's going to build an Iron Dome. When I saw that, I was like, wait a minute. And then he also said this bizarre thing. So after all the FBI has done to him, they've really persecuted him. Yeah. He said he's going to give them a big new building. So I don't know what that means. If that means he's going to, fire them all and hire a new lot of people and give them a new building, or if he's just basically talking off the cuff and just saying whatever comes to mind and whatever seems to be pleasing to the present audience. It's hard to say. But yes, to your point, he did not do what he said he was going to do. And it's kind of remarkable that so many people can continue to believe him when he says that he's going to get rid of the deep state, because he didn't do it. Now, some libertarian leaning people are hoping, for example, that if he picks the right vice president, for example, Vivek Ramaswamy, then he might actually do this, because Vivek could steer him in a way that he has a sort of inclination to do, but he just got steered away by the swamp itself, so he, for example, completely surrendered all of our health policy to Anthony Fauci. So that's how we ended up, following Anthony Fauci, or some people ended up following Anthony Fauci as our health messiah. So there was a crisis. Trump admitted he didn't know anything about public health, and so he just deferred all decisions to Anthony Fauci and company. And the result was, this multi-year catastrophe in terms of the way the government was run. So yeah, you're right. He has not delivered, but people like the way he conducts himself. The sort of, as you said, middle finger approach, and nothing is better illustrates that point than the photos taken after the assassination attempt. Okay, so those are iconic photos. He stood up after being allegedly grazed by a bullet. Now people are saying it may have been a piece of glass from his teleprompter. I don't know. We'll have to see how that pans out. But the point is, someone did try to kill him. He was bleeding. He stood up. He raised his fist and he said, "Fight, fight, fight," to all his people. And so it was a very heroic image of him. He almost got killed, and he basically was telling the people, even if I die, you have to continue the fight. So people ate this up. I mean, people who don't even like Donald Trump were like, wow, that was like something, and they're like, I was going to vote for Kennedy, but I guess I have to vote for Trump now. People are saying this all over the place. So, and now, another effect of that incredible event is that it looks like Biden will be the nominee, because no one really wants to step in and be the, sure loser for the Democrats, because it really seems like Trump is going to win in a landslide at this point. So the people who might have had the motivation because they have future aspirations for the Democratic Party, those people are probably going to wait now until 2028, and then they can just campaign on the horrible Donald Trump presidency, I suppose. So assuming that Biden makes it to the election, he probably is going to be the candidate at this point, even though right before the assassination attempt, there was all this uproar in the Democratic Party as a result of his very poor debate performance and his many, many gaffes and just zombie-like appearances on the world stage.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the next couple of months. And of course, we're at a time when everything is in flux. But one thing that has been consistent, and you make a lot of this, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about this, is that both parties have been the party of war for a very long time right now. And foreign policy is not, these aren't like, for the average American voter, foreign policy, it's kind of complicated. A lot of Americans don't understand it. And they're not there's not an immediate guttural emotional reaction to U.S. foreign policy like there is for these culture war issues that are designed to pit American against American. But in reality, behind the scenes, the United States has developed over the last 100 years into an empire all based on military conquest and quote unquote defense spending. And really every single American war, as you point out in your article, since World War I has been framed as a fight for democracy. And I think that we can have a separate conversation about World War I and World War II. I'm skeptical about both of them historically in terms of their being connected to a fight for democracy. I don't think it's as clear cut as there was a good side and a bad side. It's much more difficult than that. But certainly with the Cold War and with the war on terror, they were both seen as, we have these existential threats to freedom and democracy. You have the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and then you have, terrorism, whatever that means, during the war on terror. And so we have to invest trillions of dollars and thousands and thousands of lives into fighting these existential threats to democracy. But as you point out in your article, this narrative is just not true. So talk to us about the way in which like the Cold War and the war on terror in particular were completely at odds with the concept of democracy as being a form of government that means rule by the people.
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, when you wage a war against a country such as Iraq, you are imposing your will on the people of that country. So just from the get go, those people are denied any sort of political voice. And so in my book, War and Delusion, I talk about how during wartime, there are basically three classes of people. There are the elites, the leaders of your country and the adversarial country. There are the soldiers, and then there are the people, the civilians. And the people with the least political value in this hierarchy are the civilians of the country being attacked. They have essentially no voice and they have no power to change things. Perfect example of this is playing out in Gaza right now. These people are being killed, they're being terrorized, they're being constantly uprooted and told, you have to move now or we're going to kill you. And then they raise a neighborhood and then they tell them they have to move again. I mean, it's really, really dehumanizing. It's for sure collective punishment of innocent people, especially, even if you want to say that the adults voted for Hamas, the children obviously didn't. And half the people who have been killed have been children. So in this sense, it's the antithesis of democracy. You can't claim that these sorts of wars that destroy the lives of thousands or even millions of human beings who have nothing to do with the crimes, which are supposedly the reason for the war. You cannot say that these are wars of democracy. It's just a lie. There's no way around it. Now, the rhetoric of democracy was used throughout the war on terror to continue and prolong the war. So it was always said, we have to democratize Afghanistan. We have to free these people from the Taliban. Well, who's in charge now? The United States exited, and now the Taliban, their name is now Islamic Emirate or something. They changed their name, but it's exactly the same group and the same political structure. And so basically, all those 20 years were spent killing people on the pretext that we needed to democratize their land and show them the light of reason or something. And now, in fact, all those lives were just spent for nothing. So those people lost their lives. The country was not democratized. And in fact, the only thing that came out of it were military profits and a huge deficit for our government. So the people of the United States were also wronged because they have this incredible debt now, which they're going to be paying for decades to come as a result of the diversion of taxpayer money to the implements of war and to the prolongation of those wars.
Yeah, and if you take a look, like my favorite reference point for this has been Brown University has I don't know if they're a think tank or a group within the university called the Watson Institute, and they have a program called the Cost of War Project where they just try to quantify how much the war on terror cost. And it doesn't matter if you're like a free marketer like me and you believe that that money needs to be invested in the private sector to create technological innovation and more jobs, or if you're a socialist and you think the government needs to redistribute money to help bring about equality or whatever it might be. We spent $8 trillion on the war on terror. And again, from both, if you're looking at this objectively from both the side of the economic right and the economic left, that is a huge waste of capital. And again, that was money that they took from us without, for the most part, our consent for wars that a lot of people did not even know were going on. So it's just fundamentally anti-democratic. And you talk about another issue that people, in my opinion, are just not angry enough about. You look at what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now, and a lot of the soldiers that are fighting on the side of both of those countries have been conscripted. They're literally forced to go and fight by their political class. And there are many people in the United States that have floated the idea that maybe we need to go back to having a draft conscription. Talk to us about why conscription is just completely undemocratic.
Okay, sure. Well, as you know, I already believe that war is the opposite of democracy. But when you talk about a conscription war where people are forced against their will to go fight, kill, and die, then you're just talking about a tyranny. Because at that point, the individuals are not fighting for their own freedom. They're not fighting for anything. They're trying to stay alive. But they already know, for example, in Ukraine, that thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers have already been eaten up by the war effort, and they themselves view it as a futile effort, and so they want to continue to live their lives. And yet they're rounded up by the central government authority and told, you have to go fight, or in some cases, we're going to execute you. This happened in World War I and World War II. The draft dodgers were executed. So it's not always These days, I'm not sure whether in Ukraine they execute them, but they certainly punish them. They throw them into prison if they don't comply. And these are not just like young people. This is men from the ages of 16 to 60. This is how desperate they are. They're putting aging males out there on the front lines to just be killed. They're just turning them into cannon fodder. And the reason why this is super anti-democratic is because Zelensky canceled the election. So you could say, well, if everyone agreed that we have to keep fighting for those borders, it's a very tiny, ridiculous, limited in time border dispute. If you look at the history of that country and how the perimeters were drawn and who drew up the perimeters. It's a question for each man whether he wants to sacrifice his life for that border. And so when you force these people to fight, kill, and die, especially, then you are tyrannizing them. They have no choice. And some of them actually have died trying to leave Ukraine. They've been trying to swim across a river to Romania, I guess. And this just shows you that it's the opposite of democracy. I mean, I'm sorry, there's something wrong with my, okay. How can you be forced to sacrifice your life for a cause you don't believe in? And that makes no sense.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And we've already established, and I had you on, I guess it was probably 2 years ago at this point, or maybe a year and a half ago, to talk about your book, War and Delusion. And I'm going to link that in the episode. And essentially you argue that the just war theory is not a viable paradigm for understanding modern warfare because of the technological differences between what we have in the modern world and the way that they fought in the Middle Ages and in antiquity. The book was incredible, and I want to get your perspective on this issue that might be controversial to a lot of people. So I think that there's a growing sense that maybe the Cold War wasn't all that it was sold to us as, and I think that I would say probably the majority of Americans now are at least skeptical of the war on terror, but World War I and World War II are kind of sacrosanct in the American mind for being the ultimate example of a just war. There were clear, in World War II in particular, there was a clear set of bad guys with the Nazis, the Japanese, and then the fascists in Italy, and we had to go over and fight them to save democracy. That was what those wars were all about. But over the last couple of years, I've read quite a few historical works on World War I and the consequences of World War I, and it seems like at least U.S. involvement in World War I might not have been so benevolently motivated by democracy. And it certainly seems like in the aftermath of World War I, World War II could have been prevented had U.S. politicians done a better job managing the end of the First World War. So I want to put it to you like this. Do you think that World War II can rightly be categorized as a just war?
That's a really good question. I mean, clearly no one would have wanted Hitler to prevail and take over the entire world, which was kind of his dream. But you have to look at how the war was conducted, and you have to look at really important interventions which changed the course of world history. And I'm talking about the use of atomic bombs in Japan. So even after the war was just about over, the United States decided to use these incredibly powerful weapons against the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that, in effect, caused the Cold War, in my view, because Russia recognized that they had to build equivalently powerful weapons in order to deter our use of those same weapons against them. And so that's what caused the Cold War. Now, in terms of World War II itself, the way it was conducted before the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there are always cases where many civilians were probably needlessly slaughtered in cities of Germany, people who weren't necessarily, again, they're civilians on the ground in the adversarial nation. And were they directly responsible for the policies of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich? Probably not. But they were at least beneficiaries of some of what went on. And so, the question is, could Hitler have been stopped without using all of this military might? And people have argued that, in fact, it could have been stopped in other ways. There could have been like mass resistance where people just did not agree to collaborate with the Third Reich. For example, corporations. The reason why the Third Reich succeeded to the extent to which it did was because it had such a big industrial capacity and people just went along. And so I think there are arguments both ways. I mean, I definitely believe that it was the involvement in the United States in World War I, which led to the outcome, which then led to World War II. So you could say, back it up, roll it back a little bit. And if we had not gotten involved in World War I, that war would have had a different outcome. And then Hitler would never have had the success that he did, because there was a lot of resentment among the German people because of their loss in World War I. So it's very complicated. I don't want to pronounce in any authoritative or categorical way whether what happened in World War II could have been stopped by pacific means. But I do want to say that there are people who have argued that it could have been stopped in other ways if there was enough mass resistance of nonviolent resistance, because there have been movements throughout history where nonviolence has succeeded, where people refuse to do what they're ordered to do. If large portions of the society of Germany had said, no, we're not going to do this, then Hitler could never have succeeded. The way tyrants win is by persuading people through the rhetoric of democracy, through the rhetoric of peace, through the rhetoric of justice, and above all, through fear-mongering, that they have to support their leader. That's how tyrants succeed. So really, if you study the nature of tyranny, then you recognize that the only reason people like that succeed is because they themselves appropriate the rhetoric of just war theory to further their own, in this case, nefarious causes.
That's a great answer to that question. And it is a lot more complicated than we are taught to believe. And that's why I just encourage everyone that's listening to the show. And I have a feeling, if you listen to a podcast like this, you probably don't trust the narratives that you were taught in high school about U.S. foreign policy throughout history. I think that was a great way of explaining that the reality is a lot more complicated than the mythology that surrounds that war tends to be. We have a couple minutes left, and I just want to ask you some very pointed questions about democracy. So I'm just going to hit you with this and then let you respond. Is democracy, in your opinion, really a viable form of government? And then, even if you believe that it is, what are some other problems that can result from democracy other than just war?
Sure. Well, the classic comparison is to autocracy. So if you want to support democracy, you are opening up the possibility for mob rule. So basically, you are going to let the loudest shouting, biggest group of ruffians decide, the laws of your land. So, and it's going to be the lowest common denominator sort of argument. So people like Plato, who thought that democracy was a bad form of government. And I think Churchill said it was the second least bad after tyranny. So basically you have tyranny and then you have democracy. So it's like the best option we have. Like you either have tyranny or you have to put up with the weaknesses of democracy, which include that you're not always going to get your way, obviously, and that the people who do get their way may not be thinking completely clearly. So you see this in our own elections where people are not necessarily very well informed, but they get to vote anyway. So maybe they don't actually know anything about anything, but they get to vote. Yeah. And so that's a big problem with democracy. But the question is, what is the alternative? And the alternative is to suppose that there's some sort of small group of elites, the philosopher kings, according to Plato, or if you like, the disinformation governance board in the in the current circumstances, where you're appointing a small committee of people to decide what you can think and what you can say and what you can do. And that's a very scary prospect, because those are also just human beings. The fact that you get elected to a political office doesn't mean anything about you other than the fact that you were capable of being elected. So it means probably you're a pretty slick salesman or saleswoman, but that's about it. You can't really infer anything else from that. You can't really infer that the person is of a superior moral quality or intellectual quality. No, they just know how to get elected. Look at Donald Trump. Okay. Yep. He knows how to move a crowd. And so, So because of that, because like the qualities that lead to people being elected are not necessarily the qualities you would look for in a moral leader, you always have to be skeptical of these people, and you always need to have checks and balances. And that's what's good about a democratic republic, that we do have what you might say the backstop of a constitution. So there's a limit. You can't, if you have a bunch of crazy people who decide they want to legalize murder, that's just not going to happen. It's not allowed by our constitution. Okay, so it could happen in theory, right? In theory, you could have like so much devolution of our and decadence of our society, where suddenly a large group of people are promoting, whatever, murder fiestas or something. You could have that happen in theory, but we have a constitution which limits the things that people can do. So there are lines you can't cross. And so that's probably the safest thing that we can have. We can have a constitution which is reasonable, and that reasonable people can agree is reasonable, and then work from there. We're always going to have weird things come up, like we have right now in our culture, where people are debating, should we call people with Y chromosomes men or not? Should we allow persons with penises into women's locker rooms? I mean, these are bizarre things that have arisen only recently, and they eventually end up in the courts because people disagree, primarily because of the different types of propaganda that are used to support these policies. But there are always factors, often mercenary factors in the background, working, that you have to look into too.
So let me ask you this as a final question here today. If I completely agree with you. I love Murray Rothbard and the anarcho-capitalist tradition, and I think that is an incredible vision of what society could be. But in reality, at this point in human history, I think a constitutionally limited government along Lockean lines is probably the best that we're going to get. But even within that framework, I don't think that our own constitution is perfect. So if you could, let's say that you, Laurie Calhoun, were given a geographical territory and you were able to build a structure of government from the ground up, what would that look like for you? What, in your opinion, is kind of the optimal way to balance the necessity of having to make political decisions within a society?
I mean, I think it would have to be, I don't want to say communitarian because that's like against all libertarian thought, but it has to be,
yes.
You know what I'm talking about. So you get together and you frankly have discussions. This is like the most important thing to me. Free speech is absolutely the non-negotiable part of a government. You have to have free speech. You have to have open debate. And anyone who comes forth and wants to censor speech is automatically suspect, according to me, because what they're saying is they can't argue for their position. In fact, you can always argue for a good position. If you can't argue for a position, that just shows it's not a good position. It's not a position that you can persuade people to sign on to. And so my number one thing is you cannot compromise free speech. And I mean, absolutely, in this sense, I'm a free speech absolutist. People have to be able to express their opinions, their beliefs, and they have to be able to sort things out in what John Stuart Mill called the marketplace of ideas. Why? Because we're all finite and we're all fallible, and we don't know which of our own opinions are right or wrong or good or would work in political terms. And so that's why we have to hash it out in the public square. And when we reach a point, as we have in our society now, where people don't want to talk to each other, where people say, "Oh no, you're evil, I can't talk to you. I can just ignore you, you're deplorable," this sort of thing, I think that's very, very dangerous. And these pushes for increased censorship, went on during COVID, but people are still pushing for it. And I think that's incredibly dangerous. And it's actually, it's perilous to our form of government and to our freedom, because you can't control like who the censors are going to be. And they may completely disagree with you to the point where they want to deny all of your rights to do whatever you want to do. So I think a good limit is, of course, the non-aggression principle of libertarians, which is you should be free to do what you want to do as long as you don't impinge on the liberty of other people to do what they can do without impinging on the liberty of other people. So basically, That's a good limit right there. But we have to continue to talk. And when we disagree with people, the solution is not to refuse to talk to them on the grounds that they're evil. The solution is to talk to them, because when you start talking to people, you recognize there is a commonality, and maybe you can see things from their perspective, and then you can correct them or they can correct you. And that's how we move forward. We have to get out of this divisive moment in history where people literally hate each other because they're wearing a red hat or they're wearing a blue hat. I mean, it's really unbelievable.
Yeah, it really is. Well, Laurie, it's been great to talk to you as always. Before I let you go today, just tell my audience where they can find your work.
Okay, so you can find my essays related to liberty and freedom at the Libertarian Institute. And if you just put libertarian, I think it's libertarianinstitute.org/LL Calhoun. I'm also on the masthead, so you can just click there and get all my essays there. I also have a blog, and it's called thedroneage.com WordPress. And that's where I have especially work on war and the use of drones. And that's about it.
Well, Laurie, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.